Now let us get to the heart of the matter, the Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution was not a surprise. It couldn't have been predicted. But considering the 19th century political instability and the social context that gives rise to Mexico in the 20th century, we can't say that the Mexican Revolution came out of nowhere. Mexico starts the 20th century in conditions under which most of the rural population works on land that they do not own, in which factory workers work in factories with absolutely no legal protection. There is no such thing as labor legislation in early 20th century Mexico. And to make matters worse, everybody lives under the control and power of a president who's been re-elected for over 30 years. These long-standing conditions of economic inequality in which the poor suffer, whether they are rural or urban, combined with the long-term abuse of the electoral process in which the elites are affected, create the conditions in which a revolution is going to happen. When you've got every constituency, every political constituency dissatisfied with a significant element of the political sphere, those are the conditions for widespread revolution. Now, what is the Mexican Revolution about? In fact, it starts with that third point I just mentioned. The issue, the electoral process, democracy, the demand for fair presidential elections is the primary issue that will start the revolution. The elites demand it, and the entire country supports a shift in the presidential election system and a shift in the political system. As the conditions for that are achieved, the revolution becomes about labor rights and a definition of workers' rights and about land rights. So the response to the concentrated ownership of land and the ownership of factories without a discussion of the rights of the employees and the obligations of the bosses becomes a really important part of the Mexican Revolution as well. Now, the Mexican Revolution does not begin with this discussion on labor rights or land rights. It starts with a man, Francisco Madero, who is the first to actively oppose Porfirio Diaz in the 1910 elections. Porfirio Diaz had suggested that he might step down. They'd be willing to give up the reins of power. And Francisco Madero takes him up on that challenge. Porfirio Diaz throws him into jail, and from jail, Francisco Madero begins his armed rebellion, calls for an armed rebellion on October 5th of 1910. The document that outlines this plan, the Plan de San Luis Potosí is a city in Mexico where Madero was imprisoned, calls for effective suffrage, so voting rights, and no re-election. That is the motto of the plan, and that is the motto that begins the Mexican Revolution. Now, Porfirio Diaz gives up. They negotiate a treaty, and on May 31st, 1911, he leaves for exile to France. So, if the tyrant disappears, is gone, why does the Mexican Revolution continue? Well, this sentence, Madero has unleashed a tiger, now let's see if he can control it, is apocryphally attributed to Porfirio Diaz, the man on the right side of the picture that I've uploaded here. Madero is on the left. Now, this is not a picture that either one of them ever posed for. This is a composite painting based on photographs of the two men separately. Porfirio Diaz is apocryphally said to have uttered this sentence, Madero has unleashed a tiger, now let's see if he can control it, upon his sort of departure from Mexico as he was boarding the ship out to France. The value of this sentence, whether he said it or not, is that Madero was not capable of controlling Mexico. The tradition of strong men in politics in Latin America attests to this, that countries with short democratic histories may have a hard time imposing systems that are democratic. Madero was successful in getting rid of the tyrant, but he did not succeed in imposing a representative or stable government, and that's probably because it's very difficult to impose or even to create a representative government that satisfies every constituency. And especially in the context in which the Mexican Revolution starts, in which many constituencies are already clamoring for a change. Zapata's Plan de Ayala becomes, in a sense, the rallying cry for the rural opposition, who demand a much faster process towards land reform rather than a slow discussion on political reform. And then Victoriano Huerta comes to represent not everybody else, but a large part of the Mexican public who, in the face of instability and change, may be hoping for a return to calm, even if it's the calm under an oppressive dictatorial ruler. Huerta succeeds in this. So why does the Mexican Revolution last from 1911 to 1917 if Madero was successful in eliminating the number one issue? Well, because getting rid of that number one issue, getting rid of Porfirio Diaz, leaves the country in a power vacuum. The dictator is gone. Who will replace him? Which leads to questions of who rules, who votes, right? So in a early 20th century context in which a liberal political system is to be created, the decision as to who gets to vote is not a simple one, especially when in the countryside, that issue is much less important than how will land be redistributed. So vagaries and subtleties of electoral systems are not something that Zapata is even remotely concerned with. So the question of how elections will be organized is much less important to him than how land will be redistributed and how quickly. And so the issues around the Mexican Revolution point to that tension within a citizenship between in a country in which transitions have to happen, but orderly transitions sometimes beg people to, in a sense, delay their immediate satisfaction. And that was not something that Zapata or the other participants in the Mexican Revolution were willing to do. To satisfy labor and land ownership demands was critical to a significant part of the country, even if the ruling elites had achieved the change they wanted in the sense that they achieved the exile of Porfirio Diaz. But the ruling elites did not actually achieve what they wanted, because what they got in exchange was civil chaos. And so Madero's presidency is very quickly challenged from all sides, even from his supporters. And Victoriano Huerta, this counter-revolutionary general who tries to present himself as a throwback to the Porfirian style of governance in which a strong hand controlled all parties but assured everyone a life in a calm or at least less dangerous environment, achieved some success. But Huerta's dictatorial governing style very quickly finds opposition from the three factions that will remain. Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and Venustiano Carranza simply do not support the way in which Huerta is trying to control and return the country to a pre-1910 style of government. And they, like Madero did with Porfirio Diaz, negotiate a settlement and send Huerta off into exile. The crowning achievement of the Mexican Revolution, which comes after 3 years in which these three factions are in constant conflict with each other, is the Constitution of 1917. And the Constitution of 1917 is the document that attests to each of these three constituencies' most primary of concerns. And it's also a testament to Venustiano Carranza's ability to negotiate among constituencies to achieve a document that satisfies everyone and gets the country to support the document and support an end to the armed conflict. The three most important articles in that constitution are Article 27, which is the article that reforms land ownership and sets up a schedule and a process by which private lands will be nationalized and redistributed to peasants to be owned in perpetuity by land workers, in a sense redistributing the ownership of land in Mexico. Article 123 devises an extensive and very generous labor code that is still in practice today. And Article 3 is the one that deeply curtails the power of the church in Mexico, establishes a clear division of the power of state and the power of church, and fundamentally limits the power of the church, and hands that power over to the state. It is an inspiring piece of legislation. It is still the basis of Mexican legislation today, but it doesn't really end the conflict. It takes Mexico a couple more years to stabilize politically, Zapata is killed in 1919, Carranza killed in 1920, and Villa killed in 1923, each of them killed by political foes that they considered to be a threat to them at that particular moment. And these murders happened without greater consequence. So what is the history of the Mexican Revolution? Well, it really depends on what history you want to write, what history you read. The Mexican Revolution, if you read it from the perspective of the Mexican state, is the history of a radical shift in workers' and peasants' rights. It is a populist revolution that affirms the right of the Mexican people as it is described at length in the and protected in the 1917 Constitution. But if you look at welfare standards, if you look at the actual rate of land redistribution, if you look at the enforcement of labor rights, if you look at the way in which the state co-opted labor unions, if you look at socioeconomic welfare indicators, then the history of the Mexican Revolution may be the history of how the more things change, the more they actually stay the same. So the Mexican Revolution is both a very important moment in the history of modern Mexico and an important moment in the history of Latin America in the 20th century. But it could also be seen as an icon of how radical change can lead to, well, not much change at all.